Life rarely changes overnight. More often, it changes through the choices we make each day, the habits we build, and the small actions we repeat until they become part of who we are. People often say that building a habit takes weeks or even months, but sometimes, just 7 days of intentional action can teach you more about yourself than years of good intentions ever could. 7 days. That can be enough to realize that what was holding you back was never a lack of knowledge, talent, or opportunity. More often than not, it was your habits. The quiet habits, the invisible habits, the ones that slowly shape your future while your attention is focused somewhere else. The Stoics believe that a person's destiny is not created by grand dreams or ambitious plans, but by the actions they practice every single day. Yet many people spend years waiting for motivation, waiting for confidence, waiting for the perfect moment to begin. Meanwhile, their days are filled with distractions, excuses, and routines that quietly lead them in circles. The difficult truth is that life rarely changes because circumstances change. Life changes when behavior changes, and when behavior changes, everything else gradually starts to follow. There is a reason some people stay calm in the middle of chaos, remain focused while others lose attention, and stay disciplined when others decide to quit. It is not luck. It is not talent. It is the result of small choices repeated so many times that they become part of a person's identity. Understanding that completely changed the way I viewed growth, discipline, and even myself. Because the quality of a person's life is rarely decided by one big moment or one major decision. More often, it is shaped by the habits that quietly influence every single day that follows. Small habits have far more power than they seem to at first. Every time you break a promise to yourself, your mind notices. Every time you choose an excuse instead of action, your mind notices that too. These moments may feel small and unimportant, but they don't disappear. They accumulate over time, quietly shaping the way you see yourself without you even realizing it. Eventually, people begin forming opinions about who they are, not based on their intentions, not based on their dreams or goals, but based on the evidence their actions provide every day. Fortunately, this works both ways. Every completed habit becomes another piece of evidence. Every promise you keep to yourself sends a message. It says that your word matters. It says that your actions can be trusted. This kind of self-trust cannot be bought, borrowed, or pretended. It is built slowly, one choice at a time, one ordinary day at a time. And eventually, something surprising begins to happen. Discipline no longer feels like a burden or a form of punishment. It starts to feel like self-respect. The habit itself may still be small, but the identity being built around that habit becomes stronger and stronger. And once a person begins trusting their own word, the foundation for every future change is already there. There is another question hidden beneath all of this, and it carries more power than most people realize. Many people believe discipline exists only to produce results. They assume consistency matters only because it helps them reach some future goal. And while results certainly matter, something even more important happens long before those results ever become visible. Discipline begins shaping identity. Every action becomes evidence. Every repeated behavior becomes a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. Your mind is always paying attention to these patterns. Even when your focus is somewhere else, it notices who shows up and who makes excuses. It notices who follows through and who keeps postponing what needs to be done. Over time, these observations turn into beliefs, and eventually, those beliefs become part of your self-image. This is why lasting change has never been only about achieving goals. It is about becoming the kind of person who can achieve those goals again and again. The problem is that modern culture often teaches the exact opposite. People are constantly encouraged to chase dramatic transformations. Overnight success stories capture attention. Extraordinary achievements receive praise. Massive breakthroughs dominate conversations. But real growth is usually much quieter than that. Most meaningful progress happens through ordinary actions repeated consistently over long periods of time. Most days feel completely normal. There are no celebrations, no applause, no obvious signs that anything important is happening. Yet beneath the surface, some of the most important changes are taking place. Character is being shaped. Habits are becoming stronger. Patterns are being reinforced, and the future is slowly being influenced by choices that seem almost insignificant in the present moment. This is why so many people give up too soon. They expect transformation to feel exciting and dramatic, when in reality, it often feels surprisingly ordinary. The Stoics understood this better than most. They never viewed greatness as something that suddenly appeared overnight. Instead, they believed character was built through repeated action. Virtue was not inherited. Wisdom was not inherited. Courage was not inherited. These qualities had to be practiced, developed slowly, strengthened through repetition, day after day, decision after decision. The Stoics understood something that many people overlook. Every situation presents a choice to strengthen the qualities you want to develop, or a choice to weaken them. That is why small moments matter so much, because small moments eventually become a life. As Aristotle famously said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. A person does not suddenly become resilient when a crisis arrives. They become resilient through countless smaller moments that prepared them long before the crisis ever appeared. The same is true for every form of personal growth. Focus is not created in a single moment. Discipline is not created in a single moment. Patience and emotional control are not created in a single moment. They are built gradually through repetition. This way of thinking changes how setbacks are viewed as well. When identity becomes more important than immediate results, temporary failures lose much of their power. Missing one day no longer feels like proof that you are incapable. Instead, it becomes a reminder to return to the process. There is a difference between failing at something and becoming a failure as a person. Yet many people confuse the two. They allow one mistake to shape the entire story they tell themselves. They treat one setback as proof that change is impossible for them. But growth has never required perfection. It requires persistence. In many cases, the person who keeps going after making mistakes becomes stronger than the person who never faced difficulty in the first place. Progress is not measured by flawless execution. It is measured by the willingness to continue, even when things are imperfect. This is where small actions reveal their true importance. They give us the opportunity to practice consistency without becoming overwhelmed. A single habit may seem insignificant on its own, but the lessons it teaches reach far beyond the habit itself. It teaches patience. It teaches reliability. It teaches self-respect. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches the mind that effort can be trusted. Once that lesson takes root, new possibilities begin to appear naturally. The need for constant motivation slowly starts to disappear because motivation is no longer carrying the entire burden alone. Systems begin carrying part of that burden. Routines begin carrying part of that burden. Identity begins carrying part of that burden. What once felt difficult starts feeling normal. What once demanded constant willpower starts becoming automatic. As these patterns grow stronger, the relationship with the future begins to change as well. Anxiety slowly loses some of its grip because attention is no longer trapped by distant outcomes and imagined scenarios. Focus returns to the actions that can be taken today. The next step becomes more important than the final destination. There is a quiet freedom in that way of living. Life stops feeling like a desperate race toward an uncertain finish line. Instead, it becomes a series of meaningful choices made in the present moment. Ironically, this mindset often produces better results than obsessing over outcomes ever could. When attention stays focused on what can actually be controlled, progress becomes easier to sustain. The future begins improving quietly, almost invisibly, because the habits shaping that future are improving first. And when daily patterns begin to change, life often starts changing long before you fully notice it. If these ideas are helping you understand yourself a little more clearly, consider subscribing to spend more time with ideas that strengthen character, sharpen judgment, and bring greater intention to everyday life. Because growth rarely happens in a single moment of inspiration. More often, it happens through repeated reflection, honest observation, and the willingness to improve one small decision at a time. The more I thought about consistency, the more I realized that most people are not losing their battle against laziness. They are losing their battle against distraction. And that difference matters, because the solution changes completely depending on how the problem is understood. When progress slows down, it is easy to blame a lack of discipline. It is easy to assume that stronger willpower is the missing ingredient. But in many cases, the problem runs much deeper than that. The modern world competes for our attention in ways previous generations never had to face. Every device, every platform, every notification, every endless stream of content, all of it is designed to pull attention away from the present moment and direct it somewhere else. The result is a mind that is constantly reacting, constantly consuming, constantly switching focus, but rarely pausing long enough to reflect. Constantly consuming, but rarely creating. Constantly busy, but rarely moving in a direction that truly matters. This is why so many people reach the end of the day feeling exhausted, yet struggle to point to anything meaningful they actually accomplished. Their energy was spent reacting instead of choosing. At first, these distractions seem harmless. A quick look at a message, a few minutes scrolling through updates, a short break between tasks that somehow lasts longer than intended. Each moment feels too small to matter. But the real cost is not measured in minutes. It is measured in broken attention. Every interruption leaves something behind. Part of the mind stays attached to what it just saw, heard, or experienced. Focus becomes scattered. Clarity begins to fade. Deep thinking becomes harder to maintain. As Seneca once observed, to be everywhere is to be nowhere. Over time, this distracted state starts feeling normal. Many people become so used to constant stimulation that stillness feels uncomfortable. Silence feels unfamiliar. Giving one thing your complete attention begins to feel almost unnatural. The mind starts searching for stimulation automatically, even when that stimulation adds no real value. The Stoics understood something that feels even more relevant today than it did centuries ago. A person who cannot control their attention will eventually struggle to control their life. Thoughts shape actions. Actions shape habits. Habits shape outcomes. If attention is constantly being directed by outside forces, then decisions slowly begin to reflect those forces as well. This is why mental independence requires more than intelligence. It requires awareness. The ability to pause before reacting, to observe before responding, to choose consciously where your energy and attention will go. Without that ability, life can slowly become a chain of automatic reactions to whatever appears in front of us next. Days begin filling themselves. Weeks pass almost unnoticed. Progress becomes difficult to recognize because intention has quietly been replaced by impulse. At first, the consequences are subtle. Goals still seem important in theory, but somehow receive less attention in practice. Time still exists, yet it always seems to disappear. Plans continue being made, yet they rarely move forward. Many people believe they need more hours in the day, but often, what they truly need is greater ownership of the hours they already have. That realization can be uncomfortable because it shifts responsibility inward. It removes the comforting belief that circumstances are entirely to blame. The truth is that meaningful goals require sustained attention, and sustained attention cannot exist where constant distraction is allowed to thrive. The problem is rarely a lack of ability. Most people are capable of far more than they give themselves credit for. The real issue is that their attention is scattered across too many competing demands. I began noticing this pattern in my own life, not through some dramatic moment of realization, but through simple observation. There were days when I felt busy from morning until night, yet struggled to explain what I had actually accomplished. The effort was real, the activity was real, but the results felt strangely disconnected from the energy I was spending. That contradiction forced me to ask an uncomfortable question. Where was my attention actually going? The answer was not particularly flattering. Small distractions had become normal. Minor interruptions had quietly turned into habits. Moments that seemed harmless on their own were slowly adding up to hours of lost focus. More importantly, they were changing the quality of my thinking. Deep reflection was becoming rare because shallow stimulation had become constant. Once I recognized that, protecting my attention stopped feeling like a productivity technique. It started feeling like an act of self-respect. We protect things that we consider valuable. We protect our time. We protect our money. We protect our health. Yet attention, perhaps one of the most valuable resources we possess, is often left completely unguarded. The mind absorbs whatever repeatedly enters its environment. Conversations shape thinking. Information shapes perception. Repeated exposure shapes belief. Whether those influences help us grow or slowly pull us away from who we want to become depends largely on what we allow to occupy our attention every day. Everything we allow into our minds leaves a mark. Once you truly understand that, your relationship with daily choices begins to change. Suddenly, every demand for your attention becomes worth questioning. Not every piece of information deserves space in your mind. Not every distraction deserves your response. Not every opinion deserves your energy. For me, reclaiming focus was not some dramatic transformation. It started with small changes. Fewer unnecessary interruptions, more intentional periods of concentration, more awareness of where my mental energy was actually going. At first, those changes seemed insignificant, but their effects were surprisingly powerful. My thoughts became clearer, decisions became easier, tasks that once felt overwhelming suddenly became manageable simply because they were finally receiving my full attention. Eventually, something became obvious. Progress had never been hiding behind a lack of ability. It had been hiding behind layers of distraction. The ability to move forward had always been there. It was simply buried beneath noise. That realization permanently changed the way I viewed attention. People often describe focus as a productivity tool, but its influence goes far beyond productivity or achievement. Focus shapes perception itself. Whatever consistently occupies the mind eventually begins shaping emotions, decisions, priorities, and behavior. In many ways, attention becomes the architect of experience. A distracted mind often creates a distracted life. A directed mind creates direction. This is why protecting focus matters so much. Not because it guarantees success, but because it creates the conditions where meaningful progress can finally begin to grow. And once those conditions exist, the path forward becomes much easier to see. As attention becomes less scattered, another truth begins to emerge. Many obstacles that once appeared enormous and unavoidable start looking very different when examined closely. For a long time, I believed my progress was being blocked by external circumstances. A lack of time, a lack of opportunities, a lack of resources. And honestly, it felt reasonable to think that way. External problems are easy to identify. They are visible. They have names. They offer convenient explanations for why life is not moving forward. But the more honestly I observed my own behavior, the more I realized that many of the barriers in front of me were not external at all. They existed inside my own thinking. They appeared during moments of hesitation, moments of doubt, moments when fear quietly disguised itself as caution and convinced me to stay exactly where I was. That realization was not particularly comfortable. Most people would rather believe circumstances are responsible for their lack of progress, because circumstances are easier to blame. When the obstacle exists outside of you, responsibility can be delayed. Action can be postponed. Change can wait for better conditions. But when the obstacle exists within you, the conversation changes. Suddenly, excuses become harder to find. The mind begins confronting patterns it would rather avoid, patterns that may have existed for years, sometimes for decades. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of discovering that effort may not produce the outcome we hoped for. These fears rarely announce themselves openly. Instead, they arrive quietly. They encourage delay. They encourage overthinking. They encourage endless preparation without meaningful action. The Stoics understood this long before the modern world existed. They knew that the human mind often creates suffering long before reality gives us any reason to suffer. A person imagines future problems and begins carrying the emotional weight of those problems as though they have already happened. The body reacts. The emotions respond. Anxiety begins to grow. Yet the event being feared may never happen at all. And very often, the imagined outcome is far worse than reality itself. This creates a strange situation. People become trapped by possibilities instead of facts. Energy is spent fighting battles that exist only in anticipation. Days become consumed by worries that have no existence outside the mind creating them. The result is paralysis disguised as caution. When viewed from a distance, it becomes clear how many opportunities disappear because of imagined outcomes. Projects remain unfinished because someone fears criticism. Conversations never happen because someone fears rejection. Goals remain untouched because someone fears failure. Entire chapters of life remain unwritten because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Yet uncertainty exists in nearly everything worthwhile. No meaningful pursuit arrives with guarantees. No important decision comes with complete certainty attached to it. As Seneca wisely observed, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Waiting for certainty often means waiting forever. The future remains uncertain no matter how much time is spent trying to predict it. The question is not whether uncertainty will exist. It will. The real question is whether uncertainty will be allowed to decide the direction of your life. For many years, I believed confidence would arrive first and make action easier. I treated confidence as a requirement, something that had to come before difficult steps could be taken. At the time, the logic seemed reasonable. Become confident first, then take action. Feel ready first, then move forward. But experience kept teaching the opposite lesson. Confidence rarely comes before action. More often, confidence is created by action. The first step feels uncomfortable. The second step feels slightly easier. The third step feels more familiar. Eventually, the thing that once felt intimidating becomes normal. Not because fear disappeared, but because repeated exposure reduced its influence. Action teaches lessons that thinking alone never can. This is why courage is so often misunderstood. Many people believe courage means acting without fear. They imagine courageous people possess some special ability that removes uncertainty from difficult situations. The reality is much simpler and much more useful. Courage is simply the decision to move forward despite uncertainty. Fear may still be present. Doubt may still exist. Questions may remain unanswered. But action happens anyway. And every time that happens, the mind learns something important. It learns that discomfort can be survived. It learns that uncertainty can be managed. It learns that growth often exists on the other side of hesitation. The interesting thing about these lessons is that they rarely arrive all at once. They accumulate slowly. One decision leads to another. One small act of courage becomes evidence that another act of courage is possible. And over time, those small moments begin changing far more than we ever expected. Over time, something interesting begins to happen. Your relationship with fear starts to change. Instead of seeing fear as a warning to stop, you begin to see it as information, a signal that something important may exist just beyond the boundaries of comfort. That shift changes more than you might expect. The energy that was once spent avoiding discomfort suddenly becomes available for growth. The attention that was once trapped in imagined scenarios becomes available for solving real problems. And as this continues, another truth begins to reveal itself. The strongest people are not always the ones who experience the least fear. More often, they are the ones who have learned to keep moving even while fear is present. They understand that feeling ready is rarely what comes first. Readiness is usually a choice, not an emotion. They stop waiting for ideal circumstances because they know ideal circumstances rarely arrive. Instead, they use what they have. They take the next step that is available, then another, then another. And somewhere along the way, confidence begins to grow naturally, not because they hoped it would, but because they earned evidence that they were capable. That evidence becomes difficult to argue with. Every challenge faced directly becomes proof of strength. Every obstacle overcome becomes proof of adaptability. Every uncertain moment survived becomes proof that the mind is more resilient than it first believed. As Epictetus once said, difficulties show what men are. Slowly, attention shifts away from fear itself and toward the person being built through the process. This is where meaningful growth begins. Not when uncertainty disappears, but when uncertainty loses its authority over your decisions. The road ahead becomes easier to see because action has replaced hesitation. And once movement begins, possibilities that once felt far away begin to feel surprisingly close. As these changes unfolded, I noticed something else that I had ignored for years. My energy had changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but enough to influence almost every part of my day. Tasks that once felt overwhelming seemed easier to begin. Decisions that once felt exhausting became lighter. Even frustrating moments became easier to navigate. At first, I assumed the difference was simply better habits or stronger focus. But the deeper I looked, the clearer the answer became. For the first time, I had stopped treating my body as something separate from my goals. For years, I treated physical well-being as something optional, something to worry about later, after the work was done, after the responsibilities were handled, after the important things had been taken care of. But that mindset quietly created problems I didn't recognize at the time. I was expecting exceptional performance from a system that I was barely supporting. Many people make this mistake without realizing it. They pursue productivity while neglecting recovery. They chase discipline while ignoring exhaustion. They expect mental clarity while living on poor sleep, poor nutrition, and constant stress. Then they wonder why motivation disappears or concentration becomes difficult. Usually, the issue is not a lack of desire. Most people genuinely want to improve their lives. The problem is that they are trying to build a stronger future while weakening the very foundation that supports it. There is only so much anyone can achieve while operating from a state of constant depletion. The mind may create goals and ambitions, but the body provides the energy needed to pursue them. And when energy begins to decline, everything becomes harder than it needs to be. What makes this difficult is that physical neglect rarely happens all at once. Very few people wake up and decide to damage their health. Instead, it happens through small compromises. A little less sleep, a little more stress, a little less movement, a little less recovery. Each decision feels harmless on its own. Life becomes busy, responsibilities increase, priorities change, and because the body adapts remarkably well in the short term, the warning signs are easy to miss. But eventually, the effects begin to surface. Energy becomes unpredictable, focus becomes weaker, patience becomes harder to maintain. Problems that should feel small begin feeling much larger than they really are. Many people assume they need more discipline when what they actually need is more recovery. The Stoics understood this well. They did not obsess over appearance, but they respected physical resilience. They recognized that a strong body supports a strong mind, not because strength itself was the goal, but because endurance matters. Stability matters. The ability to perform under pressure matters. Physical training was often viewed as preparation for life's unavoidable challenges. It taught persistence. It taught the ability to tolerate discomfort. It taught the ability to continue moving, even when circumstances were less than ideal. And those lessons extended far beyond exercise itself. They became part of character, part of the way a person approached hardship and uncertainty. The more I reflected on this idea, the more I noticed how closely physical energy and mental performance were connected. On days when I slept well, everything felt clearer. Decisions required less effort. Focus lasted longer. Emotional reactions became easier to control. On days when rest was neglected, the opposite was often true. Small frustrations felt much bigger. Concentration became unreliable. Motivation seemed to disappear without explanation. Nothing about my responsibilities had changed. The circumstances of life remained exactly the same. What changed was my ability to respond to them. That realization changed the way I viewed energy forever. The quality of my energy was shaping the quality of my decisions, and the quality of my decisions was shaping the direction of my life. This is why energy creates opportunities in ways that are often underestimated. Because when a person feels physically stronger, they often become mentally stronger as well. And when both mind and body begin working together instead of against each other, progress becomes far more possible than it once seemed. When energy improves, something interesting begins to happen. Challenges no longer seem quite as overwhelming. Tasks that once felt intimidating become easier to approach. Obstacles that once appeared permanent begin looking more temporary. There is a greater willingness to take action because the body finally has the resources needed to support that action. This does not make life easy. Problems do not disappear. Responsibilities do not suddenly become smaller. But the ability to handle those responsibilities improves. A stronger foundation creates greater resilience, and resilience makes it possible to keep moving forward even when life becomes uncomfortable. What surprised me most was how simple many of these changes actually were. More consistent sleep, more movement throughout the day, better hydration, more respect for recovery and rest. None of these habits were revolutionary. None required extreme effort or dramatic sacrifice. Yet together, they created meaningful improvements. The body responded positively because it was finally receiving support instead of being expected to operate endlessly under pressure. And the benefits extended far beyond physical health. Focus improved, patience improved, consistency improved. Habits that once felt difficult suddenly required less effort because the energy needed to sustain them was finally available. Modern culture often encourages us to search for complicated solutions to problems that have surprisingly simple foundations. People look for advanced strategies while ignoring basic necessities. They search for motivation while neglecting sleep. They search for productivity while neglecting recovery. They search for discipline while neglecting health. But lasting growth rarely comes from constant exhaustion. It comes from balance, from respecting the systems that make growth possible in the first place. The longer I paid attention to this connection, the clearer it became that physical well-being was never separate from personal growth. It was part of personal growth. Every goal depended on energy. Every habit depended on energy. Every decision depended on energy. And when energy improved, opportunities seemed to appear more often. Not because life had changed, but because I was finally better prepared to engage with it. The same challenges existed. The same responsibilities remained. The difference was that I now had the strength to face them with greater clarity, greater consistency, and far less resistance than before. As momentum continued building, I discovered something else that seemed obvious once I saw it, yet had escaped my attention for years. Most people are making far more progress than they believe. The problem is not always the absence of growth. Often, it is the absence of recognition. Many people become so focused on the destination that every step along the journey feels insignificant. The mind constantly shifts toward what is still unfinished. Goals become moving targets. Standards become harder and harder to satisfy. No matter how much progress is made, attention quickly moves to the next problem, the next challenge, the next distance between where life is and where life could be. At first, this mindset appears productive. It creates urgency. It creates pressure to improve. But it also creates a strange blindness. A person can be moving forward consistently while feeling as though nothing is changing at all. This pattern is far more common than most people realize. Someone develops healthier habits but notices only the weight they have not yet lost. Someone becomes more disciplined, but focuses only on the moments they fall short. Someone improves their concentration, but remains frustrated by occasional distractions. The mind becomes trained to search for what is missing, rather than noticing what is improving. Over time, this creates an unhealthy relationship with progress. Achievements become minimized. Improvements become dismissed. Victories become expectations instead of accomplishments. The result is a constant feeling of inadequacy, even while meaningful growth is taking place. A person can spend years improving and still feel stuck simply because they never stop long enough to notice how far they have already come. The Stoics understood the value of reflection for exactly this reason. They believed growth requires awareness. Without awareness, progress often remains invisible. Without reflection, lessons remain unfinished. Many of them practiced a simple habit at the end of each day. They reviewed their actions honestly. They examined their decisions. They considered where they had done well and where improvement was still possible. Most importantly, this was not an exercise in self-criticism. It was an exercise in learning. The goal was not to punish mistakes. The goal was to understand them. The purpose was not perfection. The purpose was wisdom. By observing their own behavior consistently, they developed a clearer understanding of themselves. This idea slowly changed the way I measured progress in my own life. Instead of focusing only on distant outcomes, I started paying attention to daily actions. The change was small, but it transformed the entire experience of growth. Rather than asking whether I had achieved a major goal, I began asking simpler questions. Did I keep the promise I made to myself today? Did I stay focused when distractions appeared? Did I remain calm during difficult moments? Did I choose discipline over comfort when given the opportunity? The answers often seemed small. Sometimes they felt almost insignificant. But those moments carried more value than I originally understood. Because they were evidence. Evidence that change was happening. Evidence that effort was producing results. The more attention I gave to these small victories, the more I realized how often they had gone unnoticed in the past. Human beings tend to celebrate dramatic achievements, promotions, major milestones, big breakthroughs, and those moments deserve recognition. But they are relatively rare. Daily life is built through much smaller decisions. A difficult conversation handled with maturity. A healthy choice made when nobody was watching. A commitment honored despite inconvenience. These moments rarely receive applause, yet they are often the very things responsible for creating the larger achievements that eventually arrive. The visible success usually rests upon hundreds of invisible decisions that came before it. Recognizing this completely changed my relationship with motivation. For a long time, motivation felt unreliable because it depended on visible results. When progress was obvious, motivation increased. When results were delayed, motivation disappeared. But reflection created a different source of encouragement. It revealed evidence that growth was happening even when external results had not yet caught up. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." That perspective made consistency easier. Progress no longer depended entirely on future rewards. Progress could be found in the present moment, in behavior, in choices, in the growing ability to act according to values rather than impulses. And that realization created a kind of stability that motivation alone could never provide. There is also something powerful about ending the day with evidence instead of assumptions. Many people go to sleep carrying vague feelings of disappointment. They remember what they failed to finish. They remember mistakes. They remember unfinished tasks. But memory has a habit of distorting reality when it is left unchecked. Reflection creates balance. It gives us the opportunity to view our efforts honestly. Not to exaggerate achievements, not to ignore shortcomings, simply to see the day clearly. And when viewed through that lens, progress becomes easier to recognize. A difficult day may still contain important lessons. A challenging week may still contain meaningful growth. Improvement becomes visible because attention is finally directed toward it. Over time, these observations begin to accumulate. Individual victories may seem small, but their effects compound. A person who regularly recognizes progress develops a healthier relationship with growth itself. They become less dependent on external validation because they can see their own development. They become less discouraged by temporary setbacks because they possess evidence that they can continue moving forward. Most importantly, they begin building something deeper than motivation. Motivation rises and falls. Enthusiasm comes and goes. Circumstances change. Self-respect works differently. It grows through repeated acts of integrity, through repeated moments when actions and intentions begin to align. And once that foundation begins to form, progress no longer feels fragile. It begins to feel like part of who you are becoming. Through repeated proof that promises matter, something important begins to happen. Those small victories start forming a much bigger story. Not a story of perfection, a story of effort, a story of persistence, a story of gradual growth built through countless ordinary moments that most people never notice. When a person looks back, they no longer see isolated successes. They see a pattern. They see progress unfolding across days, weeks, and months. And once that pattern becomes visible, confidence begins resting on something much stronger than emotion. It rests on evidence. The quiet evidence created by showing up consistently, by continuing to learn, by refusing to ignore the progress that was there all along. As these lessons slowly began connecting, another realization emerged. None of these habits were really about productivity in the way I once believed. They were never about checking more boxes, completing more tasks, or squeezing every possible ounce of efficiency out of the day. The more I reflected on what was changing, the more I realized that productivity was simply a side effect. Something much deeper was happening beneath the surface. These habits were teaching me how to take ownership of parts of my life that I had slowly given away without even noticing. Not given away to another person, but to impulses, to distractions, to emotions, to circumstances. Little by little, choices that should have been intentional had become automatic. Reactions that should have been questioned had become habits. Days that should have been guided by purpose had become guided by momentum. The habits were not changing my schedule nearly as much as they were changing my relationship with myself. And this idea sits at the center of something the Stoics understood exceptionally well. They believed freedom was often misunderstood. Most people think freedom means doing whatever they want, whenever they want. But that definition starts falling apart the closer you examine it. A person who cannot control their impulses is not truly free. A person controlled by anger, fear, anxiety, distraction, or the need for approval is not truly free either. They may have choices available to them, but their inner world is still being directed by forces they do not control. The Stoics offered a different definition of freedom, a freedom built through self-mastery. Not mastery over other people, not mastery over unpredictable events, but mastery over thoughts, choices, and responses. A kind of freedom that cannot easily be taken away because it comes from within. The more I reflected on this, the more I realized how much energy I had spent trying to control things that were never completely mine to control. Outcomes, opinions, circumstances, timing. There always seemed to be some future event that needed to happen before peace of mind could finally arrive. Some achievement that had to be reached, some condition that had to improve, some uncertainty that had to disappear. But life rarely works that way. Delays happen, plans change, unexpected difficulties appear without warning. Anyone who depends entirely on external circumstances for peace eventually becomes trapped in frustration because external circumstances are always changing. The world refuses to follow a script. It moves according to its own rhythm. What eventually changed was not the unpredictability of life. That remained exactly as it had always been. What changed was my relationship with that unpredictability. Challenges still appeared. Problems still demanded attention. There were still moments of disappointment, uncertainty, and frustration. But gradually, these experiences stopped feeling like personal attacks. They stopped feeling like evidence that life had somehow gone wrong. Instead, they became opportunities to practice the very qualities I was trying to develop. Patience during delays, discipline during discomfort, composure during uncertainty. The obstacle itself stopped being the center of attention. The response became the focus. And that shift changed everything. This is where many people become stuck without even realizing it. They spend years asking whether life is fair, whether circumstances are favorable, whether conditions are ideal. These questions are understandable, but they rarely lead anywhere useful because they focus attention on things that can never be fully controlled. Eventually, better questions begin to emerge. Not whether circumstances are perfect, but whether character is improving. Not whether every obstacle disappears, but whether resilience is growing stronger. Not whether discomfort can be avoided, but whether it can be handled better than before. These questions create movement because they place responsibility back into the hands of the person asking them. Over time, this perspective starts changing everything. Criticism becomes easier to handle because self-worth no longer depends entirely on approval. Delays become easier to accept because progress is measured through effort rather than immediate results. Difficult conversations become less intimidating because discomfort is no longer treated as something that must always be avoided. As Epictetus reminded us, it is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. A deeper sense of stability begins to appear when identity becomes rooted in principles rather than circumstances. The external world continues to change, but the internal foundation becomes stronger. This does not eliminate emotions. It does not create some unrealistic state of permanent calm. What it creates is space. Space between events and reactions. Space to choose rather than respond automatically. What surprised me most was how ordinary this process actually felt. There was no dramatic breakthrough. No single moment where everything suddenly became clear. The changes happened gradually, through daily decisions, small acts of discipline, small moments of awareness, small opportunities to respond differently than before. None of them seemed important on their own, but together they created a remarkable shift in perspective. Life stopped feeling like something that was happening to me and started feeling like something I was actively participating in. The difference sounds small, but the impact was enormous. Eventually, obstacles started looking different too. Not because they had become easier, not because life had suddenly become easier, but because I had started looking at it differently. Difficult moments no longer felt like interruptions to progress. They became part of progress itself. Every challenge became an opportunity to practice patience. Every setback became an opportunity to strengthen persistence. Every disappointment became an opportunity to develop perspective. The obstacle and the lesson were no longer separate things. They had become one and the same. Growth was no longer something waiting on the other side of hardship. Growth was happening because of hardship. And perhaps that is one of the most important lessons of all. Every single day offers another opportunity to strengthen the qualities that matter most. Not through dramatic transformations, not through extraordinary moments, but through ordinary decisions repeated consistently over time. The world will always contain uncertainty. Circumstances will continue to change. Challenges will continue to appear. But a person who learns to master their own responses carries something more valuable than certainty itself. They carry stability. And from that stability comes a kind of freedom that no external achievement can ever fully provide, because it is built on something that remains available no matter what life decides to bring next. A meaningful life is rarely created through one extraordinary moment. It is built through ordinary moments approached with intention, one decision at a time, one habit at a time, one act of discipline at a time. The person you become tomorrow is being shaped by the choices you make today, even when no one else sees them, even when the results are invisible, even when progress feels slow, because the moments that seem small often become the moments that matter most. If something in this reflection connected with you, don't let the journey end here. Choose another lesson. Continue exploring ideas that strengthen the mind, deepen perspective, and move you closer to the person you are capable of becoming. Thank you for spending this time with Stoic Journal, but more importantly, thank you for choosing to invest in yourself. Until next time, remain patient, remain disciplined, and remember, character is often built in the quiet moments that the world never notices, but your future self will one day be grateful that you didn't overlook them.